I do appeals for people who have been rejected for disabled living allowance, which is now called personal independence payment, by ATOS. Now, what I find is, well, firstly, my professional body tells me to charge for those. Now, I don't charge for those, and the reason for not charging for them is this. If I charge for them, I would be automatically suspected of a bias towards the patient. As a result, it means that ATOS should also not charge, in the sense that they should not pay the people who are supposed to be assessing the clients. The reason for this is, if the government pays them, or if they're paid via ATOS, there will be a bias towards finding what the government wants them to find, rather than a bias towards the patient. Now, obviously there will be a bias towards the patient because of medical ethics. ATOS don't approach things in a medically rigorous manner. Let me explain. When I assess a patient for an appeal against the rejection of what is now personal independence payment, I find usually that it will take something like 3/4 of an hour to an hour and a half to do an initial assessment. The reason for this is that, firstly, you have to assess everything, and you have to go through all the different physical examinations, neurological stuff, blood pressure stuff, musculoskeletal stuff, which, you know, takes quite a long time and is particularly relevant to physical work. It quite often happens that somebody's disabilities don't become apparent for quite some time after the start of the consultation or the assessment. Therefore, you need to have an assessment which lasts at least 3/4 of an hour, and possibly up to an hour and a half or even longer. Secondly, there are certain disabilities that you can't assess in one session. This has a medical basis in, for example, the diagnosis of hypertension, which is done after 3 separate sessions where blood pressure is measured. As a result, if you're going to realistically assess somebody for a disability, really you should be seeing them for three sessions. Each of those sessions should last at least 3/4 of an hour, preferably up to an hour and a half. Moreover, these sessions should be done entirely by volunteers. If somebody even receives expenses for what they're doing, the possibility of corruption emerges. It could be said that the true model of disability is not medical, and that people shouldn't be medicalised because we live in a disabling society. Now, I agree with that. However, think about the implications of that for government policy on disability. What it means is that rather than assessing people for disability and rejecting or accepting claims, you would have to modify workplaces and other conditions so that the playing field was levelled. This would cost, I don't know, I think it would probably cost more than the amount of payment that's going into personal independence payment. Of course, you could entirely reject the idea of a medical model. You could say that people should take responsibility and that they are being lazy. However, I don't think it's ever appropriate, in a sense, to reject a medical model, in the sense that you should always place your client at the centre. The person in front of you is the person that you need to pay attention to and who has needs that need to be satisfied. If ATOS people are not healthcare professionals, that means that they're not qualified to judge these people. If they are healthcare professionals, that means that they have to place some form of professional ethics at the centre, which means that they have to place the client at the centre. And that means that they can't listen to any guidelines that ATOS give them. It may occasionally be in the interest of the client to be less depressed, for example, and that is a medical need, although of course depression is a realistic assessment often. And in those situations, obviously it makes sense for a client to be helped out of their depression by various methods. But in general, ATOS is not evidence-based. The way disabled living allowance, or whatever it's called now, works is not evidence-based, it's not medically based, and it's basically the usual situation where proper research is being ignored, and also there is automatically a bias. What needs to happen is, if you want to assess people, you need to have a volunteer force of nurses and doctors who have experience in dealing with disabilities, who assess their patients, not their clients, their patients, for up to 4.5 hours on 3 separate occasions, and who don't get even expenses for that. Otherwise, it's not valid. It doesn't serve anybody's needs. And I think we are supposed to be living in a compassionate society and in a big society, in other words, not a society that's funded by government, and therefore I think people will, if they have proper professional ethics, volunteer to do these things without payment. If they're not doing it without payment, then they're not part of a big society, which is of course entirely consistent with conservative political philosophy. Therefore, volunteer doctors and nurses, and don't pay them. If you like this video, please rate, comment and subscribe. If you dislike it, tell me why so I can improve, and I'll see you tomorrow.